Objects are the tangible artefacts of the past. When we examine a conflict like the Great War, what can we learn from 5 iconic objects of trench warfare in the First World War? Season 7 of The Old Front Line is coming to an end as we approach Christmas, and we've got a special question and answer episode following next weekend, looking at how to trace your First World War ancestors. Quite a lot of questions that have come in have related to that subject, and as that'll be our 20th Q&A episode, I thought we'd do something special on that particular theme. Q&A's, question and answers, starters as an experiment, really, for the podcast, and now they're very much part of what we do here on the Old Front Line, and great questions continue to come in on a regular basis, and the feedback that I get from you suggests that this element of the podcast remains popular and engaging, and I've obviously got no intention of stopping that. But it's not question and answers that we're looking at this week. In this episode, we return to the subject of trench warfare, and that too remains very popular, if that's the right word, on this podcast. We've had quite a lot of episodes looking at different elements of trench warfare, the whole concept of trench warfare, and that's understandable because it's such an essential part of our understanding of the First World War. This was a war, of course, in 1914 that everyone went to war expecting a war of movement, the kind of war that they had trained for. None could predict the kind of war that the First World War very rapidly turned into. A static war. When that mobile war came to an end, both sides dug in from the Flanders coast, where it bordered the North Sea and the English Channel, right across that remaining bit of Belgium still in Allied hands, down into northern and then eastern France, and ending on the border of Switzerland. 450 miles of a front line, and by the end of the conflict in 1918, thousands and thousands of miles of trenches within that static trench warfare. While parts of the front saw great offensives or big battles, very many parts of that front line, that old front line as it became, remained completely static. Robert Graves talks about going to the Givenchy front in 1914 and meeting officers who predicted that it probably wouldn't change. And in that sector, it didn't move from when he got there until that very last year of the Great War, when the war became more fluid and a war of movement returned. But trench warfare dominates not just the war itself, but our popular understanding of that war. So it remains an essential part, I think, of how we explain and talk about the Great War, and how we discuss that theme that we often discuss here on the podcast, which is the landscape of the First World War, because those 4 years of trench warfare affected that landscape in so many different ways, in terms of the battles itself, but also long-term effects, which has been a subject in many episodes of the podcast in the past, and will no doubt be the subject of that in future episodes as well. But in this episode, previously we'd looked at 5 weapons of trench warfare, kind of 5 iconic weapons that tell us about the nature of trench warfare, about the fighting that took place in trench warfare. But in this podcast, we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to put weapons to one side and instead examine what I consider to be 5 iconic objects which, for me, pretty much epitomise the very essence of trench warfare and the experience of trench warfare in the Great War, with, again, as we did with the weapons episode, one of those being a kind of a surprise object at the end. Now, of course, I don't claim this to be an exhaustive or even final list of such objects. We had Professor Peter Doyle on the podcast Supporters Evening the other night talking about remembering Tommy, the British soldier's experience, from a whole collection of different objects. And I'm sure that you will have your own list of these objects and things that you think of every time you think of the Great War and you look at an object connected to it. That for you will be your iconic object of the First World War. So please do tell me about your objects in the comments section on the podcast. If there's something that for you kind of sums up what the First World War is all about, share it with a wider audience by leaving a comment on the Old Frontline website, oldfrontline.co.uk. But objects, of course, they are important. This is something that Peter Doyle was very much expressing in his talk this week. It's the power that these objects have, a tangible connection to the past. And I think when you try to explain history to a public audience, something that I've done and Peter's done and other historians have done many, many times, you can tell them stories, you can relate the human stories of the Great War, of course, and then the history of the wider battles and the conduct of the war and tactics and the high command and all those elements of it. But what engages an audience very often are objects, because that is a tangible evidence of the past that links us to sometimes a much wider story and speaks volumes about a soldier's experience in a conflict like the First World War. And while these Great War objects and many others besides have been very much part of my life as someone fascinated with the Great War over so many years and having collected all kinds of different objects connected to it, you may not be as familiar with some of these objects. So what I've done, again on the podcast website, I've put a load of photographs that illustrate what these 5 objects are. So you can have a look at those on there. But let's begin, let's start, and let's look at object number 1. If I stop the average person in the street and ask them to describe what a First World War trench was like, or to depict trench warfare, I would guess one of the first things that they would mention would be our first object, and that's barbed wire. Barbed wire, perhaps more than anything else, is something that we would immediately connect with the experience of the trenches during those 4 years of the Great War. We think of those defences in different parts of the Western Front, thick with belts of barbed wire. We think of that famous soldier's song, hanging on the old barbed wire. We think of the accounts by so many authors who talk about men being crucified on the wire, uncut wire, stopping attacks going in. It's so much part of the language, really, the culture of the First World War, and the culture, I think, too, of the old front line following that war. Now, we've mentioned barbed wire in a previous podcast on the history of trench warfare, but I think perhaps more than any other object, this is a symbol of the war in the trenches. Once described as the devil's rope, barbed wire existed as early as the 1860s, designed by the French to stop animals damaging trees, but then its widespread use and commercial possibilities came with the expansion of the United States of America. Those vast, vast prairies with cattle in them, that cattle needed to be contained, and that's what barbed wire could do. You could delineate your property with barbed wire, you could keep undesirables out, and you could keep your livestock in. And you saw more and more of this being used in the late 19th century right across the US and, of course, eventually right across the world. There can have been few countries by 1914 that were not using barbed wire for some kind of purpose. And when barbed wire begins to move from something that is there for a civilian purpose to it being connected to conflict, begins in the US with the so-called fence wars in the West, when for the first time men died on the wire trying to break into someone else's property, perhaps to try and steal that cattle that the fences are containing. But in terms of the military use of it, military forces across the world quickly realised that if barbed wire could be used to contain animals and keep trespassers out, it could do the same with soldiers on a battlefield. And gradually its use in warfare was realised too. From a British Army point of view, the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902 saw British camps and defences protected by barbed wire, and we have photographs of that in collections in museums like the National Army Museum, for example. And it's clear that barbed wire now has a military application. But no one could have predicted how important it would be in the next conflict. And what the Great War did was quite literally revolutionise the use of barbed wire, but only, of course, when it became deadlocked. The British Army, the French Army, the Germans probably all had barbed wire in their stockpiles of war material, but I don't think any unit took it to France, took it to the battlefield in 1914. They were going to go and fight, as we've said, that war of movement, and barbed wire is not part of that, except to build camps to detain your prisoners of war. And you see some early war photographs of barbed wire being used for that, of course. But once that war becomes static, once people dig in, you've now got ditches in what was a field with your men in, and you need something to protect it. Their fire can protect it, perhaps their artillery can protect them, but you need an obstacle in front of those trenches to protect it as well, and that's what barbed wire was there to do. And barbed wire is almost immediately, as soon as these trenches are dug, is almost immediately used by both sides. You can't point to one army or another using it first. They all kind of realise the situation that they're in, the implications of the static nature of trench warfare, and they realise that the barbed wire that has been used for some military applications in the past can now be used on this much greater scale. And what quantity of barbed wire must it have taken to fulfil the needs of armies along that 450 miles just in the first winter of the war, as the trench system is formed from Belgium right down to the Swiss border. And what you see in all of the countries that are now part of that battlescape of static trench warfare is part of their industry now being geared up to produce more and more of this barbed wire, which, like a continuous machine, which the war on the Western Front was, drawing in men and material, barbed wire was very much part of that, and more wire had to be produced for the defences that were built and expanded upon and refined over the 4 years of static conflict on the Western Front, and indeed beyond, because many fronts of the First World War followed a similar kind of historical pattern, with a war of movement and advance and then static warfare, from Gallipoli to Salonika to Mesopotamia and even Palestine. Even the war in the desert resulted in positions being wired up by both sides, British soldiers and then the Turks. You see examples of this in the Battle of Gaza in 1917, when the 1st 4th Royal Sussex, who I've researched in some detail, took part in an assault on the Turkish positions in Gaza, which were defended by barbed wire. So it very much became the symbol of not just one battlefield, France and Flanders, but of all those battlefields where there was fighting. And this is true of the Eastern Front as well. If you look at the German and the Imperial Russian positions that are built on what is called the Eastern Front, they too are covered with thick belts of barbed wire. Now in Britain, companies like Rylands and Son in Warrington, they became one of the key manufacturers and suppliers of barbed wire to the British Army under contract. Not the only one, but certainly one of the bigger ones. And on the German side, companies like Krupp's produced it, and industrial plants across the Saarland produced it as well. But what the Germans did a lot of was to establish barbed wire production facilities close to both the Western and the Eastern Front to limit the kind of movement of this material from home, from the centre, the industrial heartlands of Germany, out to wherever it was required, actually construct it, produce it near to the battlefield so you could move up more and more of it as required. And if you go back to our episode on the Hindenburg Line, you think of some of the barbed wire defences that were built by the Germans there, 40-metre thick belts of barbed wire. That required a massive amount of barbed wire for that to be built. So it was easier for the Germans to literally produce it close to where it was required. For the British, with the resources of empire, the huge resources of industry, and a massive amount of manpower, not just from Britain and the empire, but the wider world in which that empire existed. And by 1917-18, more than 100,000 men from China, as part of the Chinese Labour Corps being brought to the Western Front, that manpower resource could move that material much more easily, whether it was barbed wire or anything else. So was there a difference between British and German barbed wire? Well, when we look at examples that we can see in museums of the First World War, whether that's the Imperial War Museum or museums on the battlefields today like the in Flanders Fields Museum or the Historiale at Peronne, or even many private museums, we can clearly see that there was a difference in the way wire was produced. Generally speaking, a bit like the whole design and the infrastructure of the trenches, with the Germans' policy for most of the war being a defensive one, perhaps it's not surprising that their barbed wire could be considered to be better than British wire. British wire tended to have fairly small barbs, not that wide apart, much more similar to agricultural wire, whereas German wire were big and really quite gruesome looking barbs that were very close together. And that's important because it makes it difficult for someone to try and cut them. If a soldier can get his hands either side of a barb and then get up some wire cutters, it's much easier to cut that wire. If there's no space to get even some fingers in there, let alone a hand, then it's much more difficult. And you can't even get the teeth of your wire cutter in there to try and cut your way through it. And as the war went on, with barbed wire, you have to have the means to cut it, and all sides produced different types of wire cutters to do that. In the British Army, from kind of big handheld kind of scissors through to a device that fitted on the end of a Lee Enfield, where you could use the weight of the Lee Enfield to push against the barbed wire cutter to close its jaws and cut the wire, all while you were in full view of the enemy, often in broad daylight. Operation Certain Death, they would have called it in a comedy like Blackadder. So if you, again, kind of move on to 1917 and you look at the construction of the Hindenburg Line, what you see there is akin to what probably now would be called razor wire. Very, very different types of wire with triangular shaped barbs on it, which are razor sharp and almost impossible to cut by hand. So barbed wire, just like other aspects of trench warfare, produces its own problems for combatants on that battlefield to try and overcome it and cut their way through it. Often it's impossible with conventional methods, with barbed wire cutters, so you have to develop a way to do that with your industrial firepower, with your artillery. And that's where the British and the French, later probably the Germans as well, begin to use shrapnel balls to explode above the wire to try and cut those belts of wire up by raining down thousands of shrapnel balls that would chop the wire up on whatever it was suspended from. And on the Somme, that largely failed due to the types of shrapnel fuses that were used that didn't effectively work and maximise the potential of the shrapnel. By the end of the war, that was less of a problem. With a new shrapnel fuse, shrapnel could cut enemy wire and did cut enemy wire in many battles of 1917-18. So it's not just the wire itself, it's how that wire influences warfare. That's a massive part of how important this object is in defining what trench warfare is all about. And if you have barbed wire, as we've kind of hinted at, what do you suspend it on? How do you hold that wire in place? And if you look at the early photographs of trenches, they put wooden stakes out there and they hammered those into the ground and they hung wire between it. Now, that's one way of doing it. They would often also produce what were called knife rests, or to the French, chevaux de frise, where you'd get a crossbeam, two pairs of crossbeams with a beam in between connecting them up, and wind the wire around them to create a movable barbed wire defence that you could position in front of your trenches. But all of this created noise in no man's land when your troops went out to put it in place, whether it was moving a knife rest into position in front of a forward trench, or whether it was sending men out on a wiring party to hammer with mallets wooden stakes into the ground. Even when they wrapped sandbags around those mallets to cushion some of the noise, to reduce some of that noise, it was still a lot of noise, and casualties were suffered by wiring parties. So what happens is a neutral country, Sweden, and the industry in that neutral country steps forward and produces what is called the silent picket, which is a metal barbed wire picket with loops for the barbed wire to be strung into and a corkscrew at the bottom so that it can be screwed silently into the ground, and you can basically create a whole system of these barbed wire pickets that you can then suspend your barbed wire between in a much more effective way of using it. So industry having created barbed wire, that having created problems for combatants on the battlefield, industry comes up with a solution to hanging that barbed wire in front of your defences with these silent pickets. And the Swedes sold them to both sides. The British ones tend to have kind of a pigtail shape at the top, and the German ones have a spike. I mean, that isn't always the case, and there are lots of different variants, lots of different sizes, but generally speaking, that seems to have been the standard kind of designs that were sold to the two major combatants, with the French following a very similar kind of design. But when we talk about barbed wire and we talk about how it influenced the fighting on the ground and influenced the way defences were shaped, there's another element to this as well, and that is all part of the soldiers' experience. What did barbed wire mean to them when they thought back to their experiences in the Great War? And when I interviewed the veterans in the 80s and 90s who were in attacks where their unit faced uncut wire, this was something that you could see often would make them kind of visibly shiver when they thought about wire in front of them uncut. For them, it was an object that I think would have taken them to the horror of trench warfare. Several of them, particularly ones that were at Serre, saw men reach the German wire on that first day of the Battle of the Somme, get entangled in it, and then get cut to pieces by German machine gun fire that swept across where those barbed wire defences were located. And I think for many soldiers in the Great War, that was something that became an iconic moment in their experience, and a horrific moment in their experience where they saw a comrade killed on the wire. So no wonder there are songs about how deadly, how awful, how terrifying that wire is to the men who were there doing the fighting. And there's a legacy of barbed wire today as well. We find it all over the Great War battlefields. We find the silent pickets still being used to hang barbed wire around farmers' fields. But in places like the Mont-de-Massige in the Champagne, we can go to the trenches there and see the wire all laid out just as it was during the Great War. That is something that is created. But if you go further down the line towards Pont-à-Mousson, just off the Saint-Mihiel salient, to the Bois de la Prette, you will find whole areas of barbed wire just left as they were, with chevaux de frise holding them up, barbed wire pickets with fleur-de-lis shaped spikes on the top, and there they are amongst the bird song and the flowers and the wild grasses within that wood, as the modern world and nature reclaims that ground around the shadows of the past and the history, often the terrible history, in those former battlefields of the Great War. And when you even just walk fields in places like the Somme and Arras, Cambrai, and even Flanders, you will find pieces of barbed wire on the positions where forward defences were once located. It's everywhere. And that legacy and this object, I think for all time, barbed wire will remain the most potent object, the most potent image of what trench warfare was all about. So we've moved on to object number 2, and that's the steel helmet. In 1914, the only helmets that soldiers had were ceremonial helmets used in peacetime for parades, or in the case of the German army, the Pickelhaube, or the leather helmet that was worn by their troops. That famous helmet made from leather with an ornamental brass badge of the state in Germany that they came from on the front of the helmet, and then for infantry soldiers, a spike on top. Artillery had a ball instead of a spike, and the whole purpose of the helmet was, particularly with the spike, was to deflect sabre blows from cavalry coming at you. So if a cavalry trooper came at you, the spike was there to try and deflect his blow as he tried to take the top of your head off with his sabre. Now that might have been useful in the Franco-Prussian War, but Pickelhaubes became pretty much redundant as the war went static in that first winter of 1914-15. And not just for the Germans, but for all combatants, because British soldiers just had the soft service dress cap, the French had the kepi, and neither of those would give any protection to any kind of projectile coming towards your head. And if you think about what trench warfare was, digging in, creating these ditches in which thousands of men were essentially encamped facing each other along hundreds of miles of France and Belgium, if you've got artillery shells, which of course both sides had, that you could explode in the air above those trenches, then a huge amount of metal, shell shard, will rain down onto the trench, and if they're shrapnel shells with lead balls inside, the shrapnel will rain down. And what you see in that first winter of 1914-15, in some of the early battles of 1915, is a large number of head injuries where projectiles are exploding above the trenches and that shrapnel is raining down, whether it's metal or whether it's shrapnel balls, and it's killing and injuring men in the trench through receiving these kind of head wounds. So it's clear, pretty clear to the combatants on the ground, as trench warfare takes a hold of the battlefield, that soldiers need some kind of protection on the top of their head, and what they've got isn't sufficient. So the French are the first to develop this with kind of a metal skull cap that was worn under their kepi. This was called the calotte, and this was produced pretty quickly by French industry and in workshops close to the battlefield to be provided to men in the front line. And I don't think there was enough for every soldier. They were used kind of like trench stores, where a whole load of them were delivered to a unit in a forward position. When that unit came out and was relieved by someone else, those calottes were then handed over to the next unit, and they were worn on the top of the head, just like a skull cap, with a little bit of tape that tied underneath your chin, and then you put your kepi on top, and that held it in place further. Now this was very thin steel, not massively useful against high caliber projectiles or large lumps of shell shard coming down on top of you. So it was clear that this was not a solution to this problem for the French army. So in early 1915, the casque Adrien, the Adrian helmet, was designed by Auguste Louis Adrien and then issued widely from this period to all French troops on the battlefield. This was a helmet that had been based on a Parisian fire helmet from 1895, and in the first few months of production, over 3.1 million were issued to French soldiers on the battlefield. And perhaps by the end of the war, over 20 million of these helmets had been issued. this particular design of a helmet with a front rim and a short rim at the back, and then a central kind of peak on the top of the helmet that was a separate part of the helmet itself. And on the front, the French adopted a number of different badges. There was the standard République Française flaming grenade that the infantry wore and some other arms of service wore. There was a different one for engineers, for medics, for colonial troops. There's lots of different designs of the Adrien helmet. And so successful was it that the design was adopted by quite a number of other nations during the conflict, from Belgium to Italy to Russia and even Japan, who was an ally during the First World War. So that was the French solution to the necessity of having some kind of helmet to protect your troops in this troglodyte world of the Western Front, where they're now living in trenches where artillery can explode above them. What did the British Army do? Well, the British Army had no equivalent of the calottes, no interim helmet that was issued. They looked at the experience of the French, they looked at that particular design. What you see in 1915 is quite a lot of officers getting hold of the Adrien helmet. I used to have one in my collection when I collected uniforms that had belonged to a British medical officer. So it had the bronze Royal Army Medical Corps officer's badge welded to the front of the helmet. It had been used by this medical officer somewhere on the Western Front in 1915. And there are famous photographs of Winston Churchill wearing an Adrien helmet when he came across to the Western Front in 1915-16. So a few of them made their way to the British Army, but in 1915 a call was put out for a design for some kind of helmet for British troops, and that led to the production of the so-called shrapnel helmet, often erroneously called the Brodie. It's called that because the helmet was designed by John Leopold Brodie in 1915. Brodie was an interesting character. He was actually Leopold Janot Broudet, who had been born in Riga in Russia in 1873, the son of a railway engineer who later moved to the United States, and he lived in the Bronx, New York City. Its design, the design that Brodie put forward, offered a one-piece steel helmet with no separate parts apart from the liner on the inside and the chin strap, and having this one-piece helmet increased its strength and gave, hopefully, greater protection to the soldier whose head it was placed upon. So while you'll see that phrase Brodie helmet in many collectors' books and collectors' websites and sites like eBay and all this kind of stuff, I've never seen that phrase used in a contemporary First World War document. What you see from the very earliest uses of it is that phrase shrapnel helmet, and that's what it was designed to stop: shrapnel from above, the explosion of these shells raining down onto British trenches, and the helmet protected the soldiers who were manning that line. So that was its purpose. It was first issued in small numbers to some units, largely officers, from what I can make out of the Battle of Loos in September of 1915, only in small numbers, tens of helmets per unit, for example, and there are no known photographs, I don't believe, of any British soldier wearing a helmet at Loos in 1915, and it took, in terms of production and then distribution, until the Battle of the Saint-Eloi craters at Ypres in March 1916 for the whole of the British Expeditionary Force to get them. So that's not just British units. By then, of course, the BEF includes a large number of men from Empire nations. By this stage, Canadians, and within a few months, the New Zealanders and the Australians will have arrived from Egypt, having served at Gallipoli the previous year. So these British shrapnel helmets were made largely in Birmingham and Sheffield, and over 7.5 million of them were made during the war, and the design was later adopted by the American Expeditionary Force too when they entered the conflict in 1917. A variation of this helmet was issued to US troops. Now there's quite a lot of stories about the helmet. When I think of these objects, of course all of these objects connect me to the veterans that I interviewed back in the 80s and 90s in lots of different ways. And talking to them and being interested in kit and collecting, as I did then, militaria, I used to ask them about the equipment that they wore, and talking about helmets was a very common thing. And one of the things that I'd found through finding helmets myself is that they often didn't have a liner, or the liner was detached. And a lot of these guys told me how they found it quite uncomfortable to wear the helmet with the liner in it, so they would remove it and often get a cap comforter, a kind of a woolly hat, and then put the helmet on over the top of that. One of the other things that I noticed looking at contemporary images is that when you look at the chin strap, you only rarely see it under a chin of a soldier. Normally, in that case, on a parade. If you look at wartime images, normally the chin strap is tucked up onto the rim of the helmet or hanging loose at the back of the soldier's neck. Now, when I spoke to the veterans about this, they said the reason for that is you didn't want that chin strap round your chin if you got close to a shell burst, and the blast would push the helmet off your head, and the kinetic force of the explosion would also push the chin strap northwards, if you like, skywards, and with it your chin potentially wrenching your neck or worse. And Harry Fellows, a veteran of the Northumberland Fusiliers who fought at Lewes and on the Somme, told me a story when they got some reinforcements after the Battle of the Somme, new soldiers, young soldiers, inexperienced, and they all turned up with their steel helmets on and their chin strap round their chin. And they'd literally had no time to explain to them to do different when a bombardment came down, smashed that trench to bits and buried some of those new soldiers underneath the sides of the trenches, which collapsed in that bombardment. And they looked round when the firing was over, and one of these lads was buried under one side of the trench. He was still alive, his legs were kicking, so they scratched readily away to try and get rid of that loose soil to drag him out. They removed enough of it to be able to grab both of his legs and give him a good pull, and they pulled him straight out. What they didn't realise is that he had his steel helmet on, chin strap on, that under his chin, and as they pulled him out against the force of the earth, that pushed against the helmet, against the chin strap, and it broke his neck, killed him instantly. And what Harry said was, when they looked at his lifeless body in the bottom of the trench, they realised they didn't even know what his name was. So that's a kind of darker history of steel helmets. And Albert Bamfield, who I've mentioned, who was in the 13th Royal Sussex with his brother Marcus, he used to talk to me about one of the kind of sounds that he remembered of the Great War was standing in frontline trenches on many, many days during the 2.5 years that he was out there, with the rain pinging down on his helmet, creating in some ways a kind of a unique sound. But he said that when he had a conservatory later in life and he heard the rain pinging off that or off the roof of a bus shelter when he was going to get the bus from Brighton into Hove, he was instantly taken back to the Great War and the memory of standing in a trench with the rain pinging off of his helmet. So even an object like this, in terms of a soldier's experience, it can mean so much. So that's the British side. The Germans too reacted to the conditions of trench warfare, and they quickly realised that the Pickelhaube they had was not useful really in trench warfare. They removed the spike, they had khaki covers over them, but it offered no protection to the individual soldier. So they too developed a steel helmet. The M1916, the Model 1916 Stahlhelm, steel helmet. And the first ones of these were ready and issued to German troops in time for the attack at Verdun in February 1916. But it took a lot longer for German industry to produce enough helmets. And it wasn't until the Battle of Arras in April 1917 that every single German soldier on the Western Front had a steel helmet to himself. When you read Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, and he takes part in the Battle of Guillemont in September of 1916, he talks about going up to the line, and the unit that they're relieving is carrying the Stahlhelms out and handing to them as they move up. So again, it's kind of a trench stores at that point, which it doesn't belong to one unit, it belongs to a trench system, and these helmets are then handed out to men going to and from the line. So the German design is different to the French and the British design. It gives a lot more protection to the side of the head and the back of the head. It's quite a modern design in many ways. And if you look at some later Kevlar helmets used by NATO troops, for example, they bear a strong resemblance to the Stahlhelm. So the design itself obviously was a pretty good one in terms of the way it gave protection. The helmets that were produced by the Germans were made from a nickel steel alloy, and over 8.5 million of them were made during the war, largely by the AG and Thaler steelworks in Germany. By 1918, every nation on every battlefield of the Great War were using helmets, not just the Western Front. Because if there were trenches in Salonika, if there were trenches in Mesopotamia and trenches in Palestine, which there were, you needed to have the same kind of protection for your soldiers defending those trenches. But the use of helmets in other theatres of war, particularly in places that were a lot hotter than the Western Front, created problems. Men got sunstroke from helmets when the sun beat down on their head and on top of their helmet and cooked their head inside. And so what you see is covers to those helmets being developed. Those kind of covers were used on the Western Front to try and break up the shape of helmets. The British used them, the French used them, the Germans used them. The British started welding cap badges to the front of helmets at one stage of the war, but it was found that that weakened the steel and a sniper's bullet could go straight through it. I mean, that could be one of those old soldier stories of the Great War, but you see that being discontinued by 1917-18. And I used to own a British helmet that had been issued to a soldier in Palestine, and that had a cover over the top of the main body of the helmet and a sun flap at the back that protected the back of his neck from the sun. So there were adaptations made to these helmets during the war. The Germans adapted their helmets to be able to carry extra armoured protection. The German Stahlhelm had two kind of Frankenstein-style lugs on the side of the helmet, and you could hang an extra piece of steel on the front of that with a leather strap to hold it in place. That was often worn with body armour by soldiers who were sentries in the forward German trenches, for example. And you also see helmets being camouflaged during the war, often roughly by mud or basic paint, and sometimes much more complex camouflage designs. There were camouflage units in most armies during the First World War, and you see that being kind of adapted to helmets as well. The German helmet in particular, that was a much sought after trophy by soldiers, where the Germans camouflaged their helmet with a number of different colours in that last year of the war. And there's another element to the kind of decoration of helmets done on the battlefield to maximise the chances of a soldier's survival. But in the American Expeditionary Force, when the war was over, what you see in many units is soldiers decorating their helmets, camouflaging them, painting on battle honours, painting on symbols, painting on divisional flashes onto the helmets. That wasn't done, if you look at contemporary images, while the fighting was still going on. It's done when the war's over and these men are awaiting demobilisation to be sent back to the United States. And those helmets became, for those soldiers, for those veterans, very much kind of potent symbols of their war service in the Great War. And you see them being taken home and kept and preserved within families. I've met many collectors of American equipment who have some incredibly ornate decorated helmets in their collections, and I've seen them in museums as well. It was very much a thing amongst American troops to decorate their helmets in that way, creating this souvenir of their war experience. French soldiers, a lot of them took their helmets home with them, and when I had some of those in my collection, one of the things you could buy post-war was a little brass plaque that went on the front visor of the helmet, which indicated you were a veteran of the Great War, and there was a circular kind of disc at the front of it where you could tap out your name, and I had a few of those that were named to poilus, again as a potent symbol of their war experience. And on the German side, the Stahlhelm became very much a symbol of old comrades, of men who'd fought in the Great War. And what you see with all of these helmet designs, is then being used on war memorials, on figures on memorials, and as symbols on those memorials. And the Stahlhelm in particular is something that when you travel across Germany today and you go into towns and villages, where you will find pretty much everywhere in all of these towns and villages memorials to the Great War, you will often find the Stahlhelm being the main symbol on that. I've seen that hundreds and hundreds of times across my travels in Germany. But the question that I'm sure you're all asking in the background there is, which helmet of these three nations that we've discussed, the French, the British and the Germans, which was the best helmet? Now, George Coppard talks about this with a machine gun to Combray, that they got hold of three helmets, a British one, a French one, a German one, and they shot them at a short distance with a service revolver. And I think he says the one that took the rounds, that gave the maximum amount of protection against the rounds that they fired at it, was the British helmet. But when we look at the designs today and the type of steel that was used and the protection that was given and how that afforded protection against shrapnel, bullet strikes, shrapnel balls, I think the modern thinking on this is that the French Adrian helmet was the strongest, the most tensile helmet issued to combat troops on the battlefields of the Great War. So if anything kind of gets it into that slot as being the best helmet of the conflict, the Adrian helmet seems to fit that brief. But helmets much wider than that have this great symbolism, and that's why I included them in this list of iconic objects of the Great War. So we're on to object number 3, and that's duckboards. Wooden duckboards became one of the great symbols of trench warfare, as they became an invention born out of that warfare and where it was fought, in those muddy ditches across those fields of the landscape of the Western Front, often in terrain that was boggy and wet, and in conditions that saw heavy rain and snowfall, thus flooding the trenches that had been constructed. Duckboards became the super highways of the Western Front, the routes to and from the trenches when they were laid over soft ground to enable movement, or placed on the floor of trench systems to provide a solid walkway for the troops. So this wooden construction, a slatted walkway, became so much more than its component parts, so much more in terms of symbolism, because wherever there was a trench, there were duckboards. So how did duckboards come about? The mud in the early war trenches that had no flooring created a big problem for the troops defending those positions. When they dug in during that winter of 1914-15, they hadn't really considered the flooring. And this is something that we're seeing, more than a century on in the conflict in Ukraine. If you look at the film that comes out of that conflict during the winter, we see trenches with no trench floor being absolutely gunked up by mud and glutinous mud, liquid mud, all the kind of conditions that we'd associate with the First World War. And that's what it was like for the troops in that winter of 1914-15. They couldn't continue to live like that, because living in those wet, muddy conditions would lead to trench foot, would lead to men breaking down under those kind of physical conditions. So it was clear that a flooring had to be put in place, and the engineers, and on the German side, the pioneers, and the génie, the engineers in the French army, came up with this walkway suggestion where you'd place a wooden walkway within the trench to lift the soldiers up out of the mud. So a bit like some production of barbed wire, duckboards could be created back home in the home country. They were built in Britain, for example, and Germany, but more usefully they would be constructed on the battlefield and taken up to where they were required. And by later in the war, there were special depots on the British side, for example, making this material made by the Royal Engineers and delivered to supply points nearer to the front line to be taken forward as trench stores by the infantry to the trenches on the battlefield, again as trench stores, not belonging to a particular unit, but belonging to that part of the front line. Now, being wooden, they could be damaged very easily, so they often needed continuous replacement. They were designed in sections so that one man could carry a duckboard up, and if you had an entire battalion of men available as labourers, you could carry up a huge amount of these duckboards to a newly constructed trench system and put them in place. And they had a kind of a male-female ending to them. The main beams that supported the slats were angled slightly so that one end was narrower than the other and could be slotted into the wider section, so they went together. They weren't always nailed in place. They were often just left there to move about. And they did create problems as well as solve them, because when a shell hit them, they would break up into fragments, and a soldier could be injured not just by the fragments of the shell and the blast, but by fragments of wooden duckboard that were now flying around in an enclosed space, causing injuries, if not worse. But the depots of trench supplies and duckboards like this is something that you see that is commonplace in contemporary images. In 2012, when we followed Simon Verdigam across the battlefield at Messines, during the research for the television programme that we made about that, I uncovered quite a lot of German images of Messines, and one of them was of their main supply depot that was in the main square of Messines village, where they kept all their trench stores like this, where there were trench revetments, the sides of the trench that held the trench up, and big piles of duckboards that German pioneers and infantry soldiers could pick up and take forward to their frontline positions, their support line trench, their communication trench, and use as flooring there. And while wooden decking of this kind of design had been used in industry or coal mining pre-war, other types of mining, the military engineering manuals from before the war really make no mention of duckboards, because a static war of this nature was never envisaged by anybody. But it became an essential part of the trenches right across that landscape of the Western Front, and not as just part of a solution to the way soldiers walked through the trenches. It was part of the wider drainage system built into trenches as the war became more and more static over a longer period, with no sign of that changing. So duckboards were the top level of the trench floor. Beneath the duckboards was a drainage system, and each nationality fighting that conflict had their own system of doing it. When I witnessed the work of the diggers at Bosinger in 2001, they excavated a whole section of British line with duckboards placed on suspended wooden A-frames. These are inverted A-shaped frames with a channel that's created by the frame underneath that is the drainage channel for the water, and then the duckboard sits suspended between each A section. So that essentially lifts the soldiers with a decent walkway to cross the floor of their trench, but also beneath it a drainage system to drain away the water when the rain comes down and when the snow melts. Makes it a much more acceptable, I wouldn't say pleasant, but acceptable place to live if you can drain away, at least attempt to drain away some of that water. But what was interesting, that when the diggers worked on a particular part of International Trench, as that got nearer and nearer to the Yser Canal, the number of duckboards placed on top of each other increased. And I think by the time they got to the edge of the canal, there were 6 or 7 duckboards piled up, indicating that they'd needed that many to lift the soldiers up out of the water the nearer they got to the canal side. So it wasn't always a perfect system. And then what I saw at Messines when Simon was doing his work there in 2012 was a much more complex system of German drainage used in those trenches at Messines, and probably used on a much wider front. They were Bavarian troops that had dug those positions and worked on them, and the Bavarian Army Corps occupied a big chunk of that front line along the Messines Ridge, and I'm sure that kind of pattern design of trench drainage was used in a much wider area, and then in other sectors where they served as well. And considering the Germans always, when they dug their trenches, it always gives the impression of them being there to stay. you can see the kind of permanence of these trenches when you look at the duckboards and you look at the drainage system and how complex it was. So when Simon's team unearthed those trenches, they found a mixture of slatted duckboards sitting on top of the drains or long planks laid on top of the drainage system. And when they were lifted off, the preservation of this after nearly a century in the ground was quite incredible, really. But underneath was this really complex system of drainage to get the water away to make those trenches livable in for the German soldiers who were there. So it's, again, we can read about this in books, we can look at manuals, we can look at diagrams in war diaries, but until you see the archaeology of this and how men adapted and overcame the problems that they had in these trenches, I think for me that is very much the importance of this type of conflict archaeology. So where did the wood come from to create probably tens of thousands of miles of duckboards that were required during the 4 years of the fighting on the Western Front alone? Because, again, duckboards were not just confined to the trenches of the Western Front. You see them in photographs in Salonika, in northern Italy, you see them in Mesopotamia, and even in Gallipoli and other places where the fighting went static. So where did the wood come from? Now, on the British side, of course, there was this vast empire that Britain had, and they could call upon the timber resources from that empire, predominantly Canada. So a lot of the duckboards, a lot of the wooden construction in the British, in inverted commas, trenches on that part of the Western Front was timber that was brought over from Canada. And this gives you an insight into the huge amount of resources that was available to Britain during the Great War. On the German side, they could cut down timber in their own country, but that reduced their own timber resources. So again, when Simon and his team analysed a lot of the timber that was in the trenches at Messines in 2012 that they excavated, they discovered that a lot of it, a very high percentage of it, came from within Belgium. The Germans had gone into the Ardennes forest, for example, and taken a lot of timber from there, brought that up to timber workshops nearer to the battlefield and created everything that they needed, from duckboards to drainage to tunnel supports and everything else. So they were using material that was a lot closer to their battle area and not coming from their own country, and not having an empire, of course, meant that they couldn't call on those kind of resources themselves. So you begin to see the kind of inequality, just through this one object, the inequality between the ability of the Germans to wage war over a long period and not really succeed in that with their industrial capacity or their material capacity, and you compare that to Britain, who has this huge resource of empire and is able to do that and has an industry to back it up as well. So it gives us a lot of insight. Even a duckboard gives us a lot of insight into the Great War. As we've said, by the end of the conflict, there must have been hundreds of thousands of miles of these duckboards on both sides of the battlefield, along and across the Western Front and other fronts. One of the greatest feats of this kind of engineering construction ever attempted in many ways. And even a century on, some still survive today. We mentioned the Mandamer siege earlier. You'll find reconstructed duckboards when you go to that trench system there in the Champagne. If you go to Bayenwoud on the Messines Ridge near Witscharter, you'll find experimental archaeology used to reconstruct the German trenches there, and that plank style of duckboarding you'll see in the bottom of the trenches there. So that is accurate in terms of what the base of those trenches look like. But you'll find original examples of duckboards in the Imperial War Museum, for example, out on the battlefields. The In Flanders Fields Museum have some, Hooger Crater Museum has some, the Historiale at Peronne. All of these kind of localised museums often have this kind of material. And then the archaeology of the Great War unearths some on quite a big scale as well. All of the wooden material that was excavated by Simon and his team was recovered by them, was catalogued and then reported on by them, and is stored away, I think, in some kind of archaeological repository in Brussels. Whenever I think about that, of course, I think of that ending shot of Raiders of the Lost Ark and that great warehouse where the art gets sent off in a wooden crate into the far corners. I don't think it's quite on that kind of scale, but there is this big repository somewhere of all this material that has been found during this archaeological work. And it's good, it's fantastic that it has been preserved, because the nature of that landscape more than a century on means that it won't always be there. In some battlefield areas, Flanders is much better for the preservation of wooden material than the Somme, for example, but it means that this iconic piece of trench furniture, the duckboard, is still there for us to see more than a century later. When we look at the experience of trench warfare, we see how the development of it created problems that barbed wire and duckboards could help solve. And if you think of men in a trench protected by that trench, essentially being underground to stop being fired at directly, to stop being hit by artillery fire and being wiped out in the open, the downside of that is that once they're in that trench, they can't see anything. If they expose themselves back up above ground level, then they're going to get hit by enemy fire. So how do they see? So this next object, our fourth object, is something that came into use as a response to trench warfare. And that object is the periscope. Armies did not go to war in 1914 issued with periscopes. Yes, they had telescopes and binoculars and rangefinders and other kinds of optical kit, but not periscopes, because they had no place in the kind of war, again, the kind of war that was planned for as Europe fell into conflict in 1914. But when that front became static and a kill zone, no man's land, was created between the two lines of opposing trenches, as we've said, how do you see the enemy? You can't look over the parapet. And again, going back to the veterans' experience, Albert Bastable, who was a soldier in the 7th Royal West Kents, they'd just arrived on the Somme front in August 1915, almost a year before the Battle of the Somme. His unit was part of the 18th Eastern Division and occupying the front-line trenches opposite the Bois Français at Fricourt. And his best pal, Bill Beckington, had never seen a German. And when they got there to the battlefield, he was keen to see the enemy. He wanted to see what a German looked like. If he was going to fight them and kill them, he needed to know who his enemy was. And Albert Bastable looked up one day and saw Bill Beckington getting onto the fire step and putting his head above the parapet, and instantly a shot rang out and he was killed. He's buried in the Point 110 cemetery there, and every time I visit him, I think of that story, and I think of Albert Bastable, who saw his best mate killed as he tried to look over the top of those trenches. So just like Bill, any soldier of any side in this war, if they put their head up over that parapet, they're going to get killed. So what you need then to see the enemy is a periscope. Periscopes in their own were not new technology, far from it. You can find them in many aspects of history. As long as mirrors have existed, kinds of periscopes had been used. There is evidence of their use in warfare in the centuries before 1914, and for example, soldiers in the American Civil War used them to observe from fixed positions at places like Petersburg and Vicksburg, for example. These were fairly crude setups with wooden poles, with angled mirrors, and they were not issued kits, so this is not something the soldiers were given by their armed forces to use on the battlefield. Periscopes as technology became a thing, a much wider thing really, with the advent of submarines in the 19th century, and all kinds of mechanical periscopes were developed so that the men within the submarines could push up their periscope and see onto the level of the ocean to see enemy ships, to see where they were going, and periscopes suddenly had a military application because of that. But in terms of a battlefield and infantry soldiers using them, I don't think that had really been seriously thought about. But with that key winter of 1914-15, with a lot of these objects that we discussed coming into prominence, we see the introduction on both sides of the battlefield of improvised periscopes, which were developed and built either on or even in the front line by troops serving there at that time. Again, often a bit like those Civil War ones, fairly primitive, a mirror on a stick, but their use and advantage was very apparent to all of those who came across them and utilised them on the battlefield. Pre-built periscopes were then increasingly used by both sides, as it was clear that this static nature of trench warfare was not going away. Often these were just wooden boxes with mirrors angled at 45 degrees top and bottom, allowing a soldier to hold it in his hands, pop it up over the parapet of the trench, and observe no man's land and the enemy positions beyond. Both sides used those in great numbers, and again, they probably would have been part of trench stores rather than belong to a particular unit. And they proved incredibly useful for sentries in the forward part of the battlefield to observe what was happening there and to look out for any enemy activity. And periscopes were adapted so they'd be wide enough so that when you used them, you could actually put your field glasses in the bottom part of the periscope and you could get a greater view, more detailed view of the battlefield beyond, up over the top of your forward trench, over the top of your parapet. As always, when something becomes popular and widely used, as these periscopes became, particularly as the war moved into 1915, private companies then stepped in and offered commercial periscopes for the troops at the front, and many officers bought these. You'll remember that we discussed this a few times on the podcast. Officers had a kit allowance and bought their own kit, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of companies trying to get them to part with their money with all kinds of objects that they might need on the battlefield. If they'd have bought them all, they'd have needed a whole battalion of batmen, of servants, to carry this stuff forward. Trench periscopes was part of this paraphernalia that was offered to them in gentlemen's outfitters, in magazines of the period, which offered these things for sale. And there were many, many different designs, from large wooden ones that folded on a hinge and went into a cover. I used to have one of those in my collection. There was a metal spike so you could stick it in the side of the trench and mount the periscope on that. There were others that looked like bicycle pumps with a periscope lens that you look through and a very thin, narrow tube with another lens at the top, so you could pop that up over the parapet. And its narrow dimensions meant that it didn't offer much of a target. Some of the bigger wooden box periscopes obviously could offer a target to any enemy snipers on the other side of the battlefield. So there was the wooden types, there were the ones that looked like bicycle pumps, and there was even a lifeguard trench periscope, which was like a kind of a concertina, and you pulled it apart, a mirror at each end, extended it out, and then you could pop that up over the parapet and observe the battlefield, and then collapse it back down again, put it in its little pouch, and have it on your Sam Brown. So lots of different designs. I mean, there are many, many examples out there of these trench periscopes. You haven't got to go far on online auction sites to see them. Now, those kind of periscopes were used by officers because they could buy them, they could afford to buy them. Ordinary soldiers largely use that box periscope design, and you see this in a lot of the photographs of the period. But another design that you see them using was the single mirror periscope, which could be fitted to a wooden pole or on a bayonet tip. There is a design of these trench mirrors where it folds out and there's a little metal fixture on the back which can be slotted over the tip of a bayonet, and then a soldier with a 17-inch bladed bayonet can hold that mirror up above the parapet and observe the battlefield using that, or fix it to a wooden pole and then use it in the same way. So again, contemporary images show ordinary soldiers using those. Many soldiers in the close confines of the trenches did want to see and understand the battlefield and the landscape that they were now a part of. Imagine being in this kind of alien world of smashed trees, of shell craters, of desolation and destruction. You wanted to see it and understand it, and periscopes gave you a way to do that without being killed in the process. So what you see is the use of periscopes being mentioned in many soldiers' diaries and letters and interviews with men who were there. Marcus Banfield, who was a signaller in the 13th Royal Sussex, he was the brother of Albert Banfield, who I mentioned earlier, with the ping-ping on his steel helmet of the rain. He was killed in 1918. He kept a detailed diary that his father typed up after the war, which I have a copy of, and he wrote the following in his diary when he was at Fleur Bay in the spring of 1916. I had a look at the German trenches through a periscope. They don't look particularly formidable, but are evidently not what they look. I expect ours look very much the same from the German side. So even in that desire to see the battlefield, often for the untrained eye, for the new soldier as Banfield was then in the spring of 1916, having only been at the front a few weeks, he didn't really understand what it was he was seeing. And that, again, is an element of this. You can solve a problem, you can give soldiers the ability to view a battlefield through these periscopes, but how do you then interpret that battlefield? And that became the challenge for armies of all sides as they fought this conflict. What they saw was often confusing and not always a wasteland of mud. If you think of some of these static fronts, Fleur Bay, where Marcus Banfield was, that front didn't move for years and years. And no man's land, as we've discussed in the episode on birds on the Western Front, became this big area of wilding, of overgrown ground. It wasn't just mud and shell holes. So there was a lot to take in, even when you could get a periscope and you could see into no man's land. What ordinary soldiers, when they were on sentry go, were mainly using them for was just to check to make sure the Germans, or on the German side, the British and whoever else, the French, were not coming over to make a raid or an attack or whatever it was. No one knows how many trench periscopes were made during the Great War and how many were used, but in the British trenches alone, it must have been in the hundreds of thousands. When we look at contemporary images, they seem to have been a regular feature right across trench systems. And while some periscopes were mobile and can be moved from one position to another and were part of those trench stores, it seems that some periscopes were fixed in position at the end of saps that were listening or observation posts. There was often a periscope in there and even scattered along the main firing line. So they became, just like the duckboards, an essential part of trench furniture, if you like, during the static period of trench warfare on the Western Front. And that was true in British trenches, as it was true in French and German trenches, and eventually American trenches as well. And by British, we mean British Expeditionary Force, so all of the Empire, Commonwealth nations besides. And there are some really great photographs of Australian and Canadian, New Zealand, South African soldiers looking through trench periscopes. That image of soldiers looking through a periscope very much dominates the photographic record of the First World War and is probably worthy of a study in its own right. And whenever I've held an example of a trench periscope in my hands, either one that I've had in my collection or that I've seen in a museum, in a private collection, and I've held it up and I've looked through its glass, like so many Great War objects, I've very much felt its power as it leads me to wonder what sights had once been seen through those very same lenses more than a century ago. I remember when I got my first periscope and folded it up, held it up and looked through it. Where had that been? What battlefield? What no man's land? What positions? What barbed wire? What hell, in many respects, had that periscope once seen? And I think, that is the whole power of all of these objects. They challenge us, they make us think, and they connect us to the history of the Great War. And this object, the periscope, is one that is very much part of that troglodyte world of the First World War that we often speak about. The static war, the war of the trenches. Periscopes would not and could not be needed once the war became mobile again in 1918. They were left behind as the trench lines were left behind. And again, the archaeology of the Great War often uncovers periscopes and if not the wooden features of the periscope itself, its mirrors, frozen forever in time. If only they could have captured the things that they'd seen during the Great War. So our fifth and final object is a bit of a surprise one. When I thought about what to include in this episode, the potential list of objects was very long indeed. But I always, when we do an episode like this, like to include something a little bit left field to get us thinking. And so this object, this fifth object, is the indelible pencil. Yes, that's right, a pencil. Has our podcast host lost it, you're asking? Well, first of all, what is an indelible pencil? Dating back to the mid-19th century, these pencils bring together graphite and permanent ink, enabling the user to write under almost any conditions, including in the wet and the rain, and to write on a surface, be that paper or something else, and for that mark to be permanent. These pencils, indelible pencils, were activated either by the natural moisture in the air, or it would require a soldier to lick the tip. And doing this could lead to a slight bleed in the pencil's ink and graphite, resulting in the soldier getting a blue tongue. It must have looked very odd. And in the same way, when the pencil was written onto paper or other material, the ink, if you like, from the pencil bleeds into that material, making it fully permanent. It will not smudge. You can't rub it out like you can do with a conventional pencil. It's a permanent marker in many respects. The colour script of most of these pencils and what they left behind was therefore a kind of bluish purple colour, and so easily identified when we look at Great War documents. We can look at a letter or a field postcard or a war diary report, and we can see instantly that it's written in indelible pencil by the colour of it. So by the time of the Great War, this type of pencil was very popular in the wider civilian world and very common across different workplaces and in that civilian life. Many men serving or who joined the territorials or the New Army in 1914 or left homes in France or joined regiments in Germany, many of them already had indelible pencils, and if not, they were very easy to get hold of from army shops and canteens, or have them sent to them through the army postal system from their family back home, and that's something that you see happening a lot. So pretty much every soldier in the trenches of the Western Front or on any front would have had one of these pencils, and some of the veterans that I knew back in the 80s and 90s still had them amongst their war souvenirs, often tucked in their 1914 Christmas tin. And one of them still used his pencil to write out his shopping list, for example. You find evidence of these pencils in the letters and the postcards sent home, and you find them used to write private diaries. You even find them all over official papers from the Great War, from field messages, combat reports, marks on trench maps to nominal rolls, and to war diaries that are written in field pencil. They were used to mark the grim realities of the cost of trench warfare when it came to casualty figures entered into the casualty reports, or used to inscribe a soldier's name on a wooden cross in a cemetery near the front line. Soldiers used them to write their name and details onto webbing equipment or to other gear that they had, and I've owned lots of uniform items when I collected that kind of stuff that had details of the soldier who'd once had this bit of kit written in indelible pencil on them, and the writing was as good as the day that it had been added. It's incredible, the longevity of this indelible pencil mark. Stretcher bearers during the war also had them, part of their kit, for them to write the details of a casualty onto a casualty card. So when a soldier was wounded, got to a stretcher bearer, or a stretcher bearer got to him, he'd dress his wound, clean that wound and dress it, and then he would produce a casualty card and he'd write the soldier's details on it, and the details of the wound, and that was pushed into a rubberized container to protect it from the elements, and that was then tied to the soldier's uniform, normally around a button. And using the indelible pencil meant there was a much greater chance of that casualty card arriving intact and legible when the soldier got to the next medical establishment, and the men there could figure out what was wrong with him, because by the time he got there, he could be unconscious and be unable to tell them himself. So it was a really important part of their kit for noting down a casualty's details, but it could be used in another way by marking a symbol onto a soldier's forehead. So when a soldier was treated by a stretcher bearer, often it would require them to issue morphine, which was normally done in tablet form, placed under the tongue. And they would use the indelible pencil to write the letter M on the soldier's forehead to indicate that he had been given a single morphine dose. And the idea behind that was, if you didn't note that down, again, when they got to the next medical facility, that soldier could be unconscious. They might think that he didn't have morphine, and they could give him another dose or a bigger dose, unknown to them that he'd had some previously, and they could overdose him. They could kill him by giving him too much morphine. So the pencil was used for that purpose. Used on the casualty cards, knowing that the rain would not blur or wash off the script written on them, and used to write that letter M on a soldier's forehead in the midst of shot and shell to indicate that he'd been given a morphine dose by the stretcher bearers. So even in just that respect, you can see how important these little pencils were. And when you think of the millions of men who served just on the Western Front, and likely each one of them would have had at least one indelible pencil, we're talking about millions of these pencils were brought to the battlefield during the Great War. So this small, seemingly inconsequential artefact was found everywhere, in every trench. And again, I've seen them uncovered in archaeological work on the battlefields today. They survive, particularly in that wet soil of Flanders. One of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers that was found by the diggers in 2001 had the remains of an indelible pencil tucked in where his left tunic pocket would have been. And so, if you ever get the opportunity to hold one of these wartime indelible blue pencils, perhaps you already have one in your collection or in your family archive, but holding it in your hand, think about what it might have placed onto paper, what words it might have formed, and what sentiments it might have expressed more than a century ago. Was it a letter home? Was it a man's name entered on a casualty roll? Was it details of a wound on a casualty card, or a letter written on a morphine-dosed soldier's forehead during some of the toughest fighting on the Western Front? And like all of these 5 objects that we've examined in this podcast, what does it tell us about that conflict deep in that troglodyte world of trench warfare? What would that pencil have written all those years ago across the pathways of the past? And what would it have said about that old front line? You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.